Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Mr. Tim Schultz, President of the First Amendment Partnership. We have with us Mr. Andre Wong, General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And finally, we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here again. Looking forward to our conversation. You know, whenever you hear about the Internal Revenue Service doing something, usually everybody starts to get nervous. But just recently, the IRS decided it wanted to relax its long-standing ban on churches engaging in political campaign activities. Churches, of course, have to decide whether or not they're going to move forward with this type of decision. And they have been saying for a long time that they thought that this was part of their First Amendment rights from the very beginning. Many church organizations that serve charitable and religious and educational and scientific and other similar purposes are eligible for nonprofit status. However, these groups have to put themselves in a position where they're not engaging in any activity that's substantially using resources for lobbying. All of this got started in 1954 with what many of us call the Johnson Amendment, initially put in place by Senator Lyndon Johnson, saying if you're a tax-exempt organization, you may not participate or intervene in any political campaign. You know, Tim Golden, all of a sudden the IRS has been dealing with this regulation for 70 years. 70 years later, they wake up one day and they say, listen, this doesn't really matter anymore. Go ahead and do whatever you want to do in churches. And maybe churches still do what they've always been doing, but why open up this door and particularly start this conversation all over again that we thought was already well settled?
Well, Orland, I think this is about a couple of things. One, I think we have to understand this is really about churches not being punished for taking any stance one way or another, but it's really about protecting the tax exempt status of churches, right? That's at the core, I think, of this discussion. So it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing is, just because somebody can do something doesn't mean that you ought to do something, right? So what we are able to do, in particular, if we just draw from the Christian example, there are lots of things that Christianity says you may be able to do. You may be able to go get drunk or smoke cigarettes or to live a riotous life, but does that mean you should do it? And I think when it comes to issues of faith and politics, it's one thing for a church to come out and morally condemn government and say government is doing this wrong or that wrong, like a lot of the Christian abolitionists did in the 19th century during slavery. That's one thing to do, but it's another thing to come out and openly endorse political candidates and to turn churches into PACs or super PACs, right? The question there is that something that a church should do? And what is the overall effect of that kind of heavy political involvement on the religious mission of churches? So my answer to this question is going to be, can we do it? Yes. Should we do it? No, because I think the church's involvement in politics is involved in the political with a big P, but not in Democrat, Republican, left, right, not in ideology.
Agree, and you know it is also worth pointing out that really the change in this IRS reg really isn't a change in the Johnson Amendment itself, but more of a change of enforcement. And really, you know, that it goes to that issue. You know, can you do it? Yes. Should you do it? No. You know, churches have an inherently spiritual mission, spiritual purpose. You know, the primary role is to nurture spiritual growth, build community, and not serve as political actors. And so it can create this perception that faith or salvation is tied to political identity. And so, which, kind of dilutes the, kind of the universal nature of most religious messages. But also, the practical application on this too is it would ultimately divide congregations and alienate members. Political endorsements often it divides communities, but will divide a church community, and it's not something that we want in our houses of worship. So especially in diverse congregations with ranges of political views, whether it be Baptist, Catholics, or Seventh-day Adventists. So members could ultimately feel judged, excluded, or even pressured to conform in whatever positions the church is taking.
I agree that even if the Johnson Amendment were to be repealed, this should not really affect what most churches do, that endorsing and supporting candidates. I mean, I don't care how monolithic of a church you are, you're always going to have people who have different views and different perspectives on this, and the pastor getting up there doing this is really problematic. From a constitutional perspective and from an IRS enforcement perspective, I don't think the very limited nature of what the IRS did is entirely bad. So to be clear, all the IRS has said is that it's not going to enforce if a pastor endorsing or presumably opposing a candidate from the pulpit or through normal means of communication. So this isn't, running the campaign out of there. This isn't in campaign contributions. This isn't, turning the church into a political grandstand. It's just simply the pastor making comments. And, I do think that's sort of a common sense enforcement mechanism that I think the IRS has had for a very long time, because you do get into a lot of questions. What does it mean to endorse or oppose? So that, the very clear example is, I endorse Orlin Johnson as next president of the United States. But, what if you say, listen,
I do too, John.
Listen, we agree. But, what happens if a pastor gets up there and says, an issue of life is so important that you should never vote for a candidate that is, pro-choice or pro-abortion? Is that opposing or endorsing a candidate for office? Even though that's an issue the pastor should be able to talk on, it causes a whole lot of intrusion that I think the IRS should stay away from. And so it is better if both the IRS and the government sort of stay out of this space. We'll see what happens down the road.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out that there have been lots of people opposed to the Johnson Amendment who have openly violated it and sort of invited the IRS. They've sent letters, they've sent tapes to the IRS of flagrantly violating the amendment and said, come get us, you're right, come arrest us. And through multiple administrations, this began, I believe, under the Obama administration, that hasn't happened. And so I think that what happened here was just making something official that had been unofficial enforcement policy for quite some time. I think it's also worth noting, I myself would very much oppose if my pastor endorsed political candidates. I'm an Anglican, and in our tradition, that would just be seen, I think, as verboten. But I think I think one of the worst things about the Johnson Amendment, which, remember, began as an act of vengeance by Senator Johnson against some churches that had more or less endorsed one of his opponents, right? So it has these kind of seedy origins. Mm-hmm. But I just think since that era, there's just been this idea that politics is secular business and that the church is sort of spiritual business. And I think that's just not quite true, right? That was essentially the argument that the National Association of Evangelicals made for not being involved in talking about the immorality of Jim Crow, right? Hey, we're here to save souls, not to deal with the political, right? And I think many of the so-called white moderates that, MLK excoriates in his letter from Birmingham jail were falling onto this argument that, hey, look, politics is really outside of the realm of the spiritual, which is what we're doing here in church. Now, that doesn't mean that churches should be endorsing candidates, but we're all Christians here, and Christianity has moral and ethical implications, and some of those moral and ethical implications overflow into the public square. I think we need to be very cautious about talking about what the Bible prescribes specifically with respect to a specific policy, capital gains taxes or the sizes of budgets. I think that we're on pretty thin ice when we do that. But also to sort of create a norm that really church is about spiritual and politics is about the secular, and never till the two shall meet. I think that's a recent construct that all got mixed up with sort of the high wall nonsense of the Supreme Court's jurisprudence of that era also. And I think that's done enormous damage to the evangelical church in America, which I think has abdicated in for much of its life the really great tradition, the justice tradition that goes back to Frederick Douglass, that goes back to, to many of the founders, the ones that were right, and goes back to some of the best justice movements in American history.
But Andre, am I fooling myself? I mean, churches are just a microcosm of society. I mean, I've gone to churches to speak where they've told me, hey, just so you know, this is a blue church, or just so you know, this is a red church. I mean, the idea that I can make that type of determination means the politics is probably already running there. So why not just get rid of the Johnson Amendment? Well, it seems like we're trying to kind of play this kind of tricky game of we got a rule, but nobody enforces it. So therefore now let's codify that it's not enforced. I mean, what is the game that's being played here?
Right, and so the whole notion of blue churches and red churches, or red states and blue states, or red communities and blue communities, is really a recent phenomenon. So it never used to be the issue. It never used to be a question that standing up for issues of justice and peace and human dignity, those were not political issues. And so when we talk about the moral and kind of prophetic, frankly, responsibility of churches, faith traditions have long challenged governments and political leaders on these issues. And so in that sense, I don't think that churches should shy away from that. These issues have crossed the partisan line, but I don't think that churches should have to now just kind of stand back and say, oh, well, we don't want to be political, so we're just gonna stay with worship and things theological. So I still think that churches should be involved at that level.
I think it's important to reflect on what churches do and how they function. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, for example, has an entire department dedicated to legislative affairs. That's political. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church in that context is not functioning as some sort of political hack, endorsing parties or involvement in political ideology. They're functioning morally, really, and politically as sentinels, right? As guardians of religious freedom, to stand up and tell government, whether here or abroad, when it comes to religious freedom, you're wrong. That's a very legitimate involvement in politics that we have to keep in mind. It becomes illegitimate when we lapse into ideology and we start endorsing this candidate or that candidate or this policy or that policy, because for a lot of the reasons Andre said a few moments ago, we just end up alienating people, and we should be in the business of protecting religious freedom, not undermining it.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but it sounds to me like what we've always seen in the past. Any piece of legislation that's targeted usually for only one particular group probably turns out to be bad legislation, and that's probably what we're seeing here. Bad legislation that's trying to be codified to make it usable. There's a case that's called Kuilema versus Calvin University. And for those of you who don't know, Calvin University is a world-class Christian university that's based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It prepares its students to engage the world with faith through curiosity and conviction. And one of its requirements is that its administrators and professors are being asked to uphold the university's beliefs in word and in deed. However, a couple of years ago, there was a former professor that sued the university after his contract was not renewed for publicly violating one of those conduct expectations. He is now asking the court to punish Calvin for upholding its religious beliefs. This particular professor was involved in what many would call a same-sex marriage activity in which he was officiating, and the university came back and said that that activity violates our beliefs and our teaching, and as a result thereof, you can no longer be here. When I take a look at these type of cases, Todd, we're seeing more and more pushback that's happening with faculty members that believe that even though I'm working for a Christian institution or a religious institution, I still have some fundamental rights as an individual that should probably supersede the rights of what this particular institution may want to see me do from an engagement standpoint. And I'm wondering, are we starting to see where this line is getting more and more blurred, and the fight seems to be happening so much? I'm wondering if religious institutions are going to be having a big problem, in particular in a place like Michigan, where they actually have a Civil Rights Act that looks like it may protect individuals like Mr. Kuilema. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Orland, this issue is absolutely one that's in flux right now. So Michigan did change its Elliott Larson Act, which is what it called, a couple of years ago. I think we've talked about this in some other shows. That is currently being challenged in the federal court system about what religious employers can do, and to the extent that they are entitled to an exemption, which does not exist in the statute. Individuals like this professor, of course, have various claims they're wanting to bring. And the challenge, though, is, just because someone puts in a complaint doesn't mean it's true. And so we have a judicial system that's designed to sort that out. But when you start asking a court system like, well, listen, is the religious reason that the employer gave the true one, or is it this other reason the employee gave, that becomes problematic. It's one thing if they're deciding, was the employee's performance, like say, you're working for IBM or something, there you're not getting into sensitive areas. But here, second guessing the decisions of faith-based organizations is problematic. And I think ultimately claims like this are going to need to go down and not prevail, just because religious employers have the right to exist, and they can't exist if they don't get to choose who carries on their mission.
Tim Schultz, when I look at these type of matters, though, it starts to get a little confusing as to when am I, quote unquote, working for an institution, and when am I on my own just acting as my own individual, or is my life connected no matter where I am, no matter what I do?
I mean, I promise you, Orland, that if you officiated a same-sex wedding, you'd get, somebody that you work for would come and have a serious discussion with you, right? And I think that properly so. I think that for me, the interesting thing is if you do a survey of Christian higher education in the United States, and there's a lot of very conservative people who are concerned about the trajectory of Christian higher ed. It's going soft, or it's going in progressive places. Calvin College would be on the top or near the top of the list of schools of concern for those conservative people. And yet here's Calvin probably firing somebody for officiating a same-sex wedding. Again, I have long thought that those concerns are misplaced about the so-called progressive drift of Christian higher ed. And I actually think this is a case in point where I'm right and the conservative worriers are wrong.
So Tim Golden, how can that be the case? Because if I'm looking at this individual, for some reason, the university, it sounds like, tried to go back and forth and maybe even come to some type of understanding, which made me wonder, were they willing to, quote unquote, bend their principles a little bit if the professor bent his principles a little bit? Or am I missing something here?
Well, I think as Todd said, the situation is in flux, and there's a lot that we don't really know, right? There's a lot of courts have a fact-finding function, and they have to go through and as Todd said, they have to kind of sort these things out. So I'll defer to that. I will say that on its face, I tend to think that, as a faculty member at a American college and university, I can say that, when you sign on to the job, right? And a lot of schools, I'm sure Calvin has this, I believe my former employer, Walla Walla University, did. You sign a statement of faith, right? And you're basically making an agreement that, hey, when I work here, I plan to uphold in every aspect of my life, whether I'm standing in front of students or grading papers or not, even in my private life, right? You make certain moral and spiritual commitments, and the school wants you to live by that, because the theory is if you're going to be a Christian, you're going to be a Christian at all times, not just while you're here. Now, you can argue about what that means and whether or not he was trying to show compassion on people that are kind of ostracized from religious communities. Again, that the courts will have to sort that out. But prima facie, to me, I think Calvin has a pretty strong argument here.
No, Andre, you've represented these type of institutions before, and I guess the real question is you sign off on something, quote unquote, in your contract, but if it turns out something in your contract seems to violate other aspects of the law, does it make it voidable in any way, or is it something where once you sign on, you're kind of locked in? I believe that religious institutions should be allowed to enforce what they believe, but then on the same hand, I have to wonder, where do we draw the line based on what I do in my private life as to what I'm doing, quote unquote, when I'm working for an institution?
Right. Yeah. So as has been stated, as a religious institution, it's entitled to uphold its mission and vision via its conduct policies. And when I teach my classroom law courses, what I tell these aspiring teachers and actually current teachers in our education system, that you are not only Mr. Johnson in the school, in the classroom, you are Mr. Johnson everywhere you go, when you're going in the grocery store or out running your errands. You are Mr. Johnson, the teacher, everywhere. Not only from an influence standpoint for your students, but from an employment standpoint as a teacher and an employee of a private denomination. So but here's the argument for Professor Kuilema, is that before performing the ceremony, he actually consulted with his pastor and department chair before officiating, and so he really believed he was in good faith and being consistent with the church's teaching. So really kind of sought safe harbor before performing this and officiating this ceremony, and so really this wasn't an act of defiance, but really, he sought to cross his T's and dot his I's before officiating in the ceremony.
Now, I was going to say, I often wonder what would have happened if somebody would have, and this goes with Andre sort of advocating for the professor now. What happens if someone sees him in the grocery store routinely being rude to cashiers? Is that going to, or doing things that are off-putting in public? Things that might not necessarily be illegal, but that are immoral. And that's the question I would have. Where do you draw the line with this?
Yeah, I think, Tim, that raises two different issues. First of all, there's a matter of sort of enforcement and how how any employer sort of polices and enforces off-duty conduct. And then I think the other issue is, how does it reflect in the organization? So if you just simply got reports of this and he was kind of known as being kind of a jerk in the place, probably not going to do something. If there was a situation, say, where someone videotaped him berating a person and it sort of became something that reflected poorly upon the university, I could see them taking an action. But I think it's a little bit of a false sort of straw man argument to say that because a university, doesn't perfectly enforce everything that could be considered non-Christian and expect that out of their employees 100% of the time, they're not being sincere, right? Like, standards of what is rude and so forth and what's appropriate vary a lot. And, that is a lot different than a person openly and willingly doing something that's contrary to the organization's principles. Now, in this particular case, that there is some ambiguity there. The good news, though, is that as far as those legal claims exist, the Michigan Intermediate Court appellate dismissed his claims on it came to the same-sex wedding and only left his claims of sort of race discrimination alive. So those issues are no longer part of the case. This was decided in July of this year. So the appellate court narrowed down the issues.
But that still puts us in a weird situation, though, Todd, because you've got these institutions that do have, quote unquote, secular connections. For example, accreditation bodies and things of that nature. And we're starting to see some trickiness regarding how are we, quote unquote, being inclusive, because we do kind of rely to some degree on what I would call non-Christian organizations, whether it's accreditation or certain rules and regulations. How do we end up managing all that? Or is that just something we're going to see down the road that one day we're going to hit a real heavy wall?
Well, so sure, first of mind, keep in mind, courts of universally held accrediting bodies are not the government, they're private entities. So I think right there that sort of takes some choice. Schools have a choice, especially now, which accrediting bodies they work with. Also, the Higher Education Act prohibits these organizations from basing their decisions on the religious faith and teachings. And while there's a lot of problems with accrediting bodies, schools have been able to navigate this without running afoul of their beliefs. So accrediting bodies can look at things like, for instance, educational degrees of the professors, but maybe not get into as much as, what is being taught in the classroom.
Well, that's some great information. And I think if we kind of understand that religious institutions, in particular universities, should be allowed to manage their organizations the way they see fit, hire what they want, and also put rules and regulations in place that they want, is the best way to operate. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
As we look to the 2026 midterms, we are seeing a record number of members of Congress not running for re-election. But most notably, we have 10 representatives and 1 senator that are not running for re-election because they're running for governor of their state.
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
The term shadow docket has become popular in the last few years with regard to longstanding practices of the Supreme Court going back decades. But the term itself did not exist until a 2015 article by a University of Chicago professor.
Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Erlen, it's been a long time since we've been together, and so I remarked at the beginning that we felt like we were getting the band back together. I think if we ask ChatGPT what to name our band, they may suggest something like Big Head Todd and the Monsters. Unfortunately, that name is already taken, and Big Head Todd and the Monsters are on tour in 2026.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Well, just to pick up on Tim Schultz's point there, I think we're all lawyers here. I think we should call our group the Hypotheticals. But beyond that, yours truly is an actor and will be performing next spring leading up to America's 250th anniversary on July 4th in Portland, Oregon as Justice Thurgood Marshall in the one-man show Thurgood. It's my reprisal of this role. I've done it before, but I look forward to doing it again.
Wow. Well, thank you. Didn't know we had a thespian here with us. Appreciate our conversation today. And thank you again for being with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.